Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Louise Caron. I am the Executive Director here at the Center for Art Law. Welcome. Thank you for joining us in this digital space and for this conversation about what happens after an artist endows a foundation. So thank you to our speakers, Sekou Campbell and Sing Lee Lathan, for being here with us today. Our moderator, Irina Tarsis, will introduce them shortly. Thank you also to our interns, Andrea and Claire, for putting the materials together with the help of Minelli, the center's clinical fellow this summer. If this is the first time that you're attending one of our events, let me give you a brief introduction about the Center for Art Law. We are a Brooklyn-based nonprofit organization focusing on research and education to offer resources and programming for the advancement of a vibrant art and law community worldwide. Through our website, we have also newsletter and events. We disseminate information and keep our audience updated about art law related news, programs, new cases, publications, and so much more. And now fully online, the center facilitates conversations by hosting and participating in programs such as today. We also have a wonderful internship program that allows our students to get firsthand experience in art and cultural heritage law. So this does not even begin to explain everything that we do. So we invite you to subscribe to our newsletter and to receive updates and invitations. You can also visit our website at itsartlaw.org and become a member to get access to all of our articles, recordings of past events, as well as complimentary tickets to webinars. Before we begin, a few of the usual housekeeping items. So this program is currently recording for archival purposes. You feel free to turn off your camera and please remain muted except for the panelists for the duration of the program. If you have any questions for our wonderful panelists, please ask them using the chat box. We'll be monitoring the chat and we'll be answering questions towards the end of the program. And we'll be also putting a lot of links and relevant resources into the chat, including our handouts in a few seconds. And we'll happily help with any tech issues. And a link to the handout will also be sent to you later today, along with the recording, a survey, and other relevant materials pertaining to today's conversation. So without further ado, let me now introduce Irina Tarsis, the founder, managing director at the center, who will present the speakers and get the conversation started.
Thank you, Louise. Hello, everybody. Welcome. It is delightful to be continuing with our programs related to estate planning for artists. And we have to acknowledge that we are now in the second half of our summer term. So many thanks to all of our interns and fellows for working on this program and other programs. Today, we are talking about what happens after an artist creates some kind of testamentary vehicle to take care of his or her legacy. How easy or difficult it is actually to follow through for those who are left behind with the treasures that the artists have created during their lifetimes. The conversation is going to start in a moment, but to get us all on the same page, I love using the example of Mark Rothko for a number of reasons. First of all, he left a very brief will before he died. He had a 2-pager signed in 1968, so 2 years before his suicide. And the will that he left said, take care of my expenses. Here are the 3 executors who will then take care of my foundation, which he also created before he died. And he allocated a certain amount of money to his family. About 10 years later, after many, many lawsuits, or you can say one lawsuit that lasted for nearly a decade, funds were distributed one way or the other, some to his family and some to the foundation that he set up. And the foundation itself, what happened to it? Well, the Mark Rothko Foundation was dissolved in 1990. So this is an interesting story about how artists think about their legacy and what actually might happen after they are no longer in this world. The second example to get us thinking is a Joan Mitchell foundation, or the artist Joan Mitchell, who was born in the United States, but she died in France. She did not set up a foundation during her lifetime, but she did have a will. And after her will, after she passed, after her will was probated, I don't know if it was actually probated in France or not, but in the will, she indicated that she wanted a foundation to be formed to take care of her legacy. This is a snapshot of the Joan Mitchell Foundation's website. You can see that it has multiple purposes for existence. It takes care of Joan Mitchell's legacy. It helps other artists with professional development, fellowship, grants, etc. And Joan Mitchell Foundation actually is doing a lot of wonderful work informing artists about possibilities of how legacy planning can look. It doesn't have to be an artist-endowed foundation for every single artist interested in preserving their legacy. Well, as I mentioned, the center has been asked and asking itself questions about what should artists do, what can artists do, and what can lawyers and non-artists, but appraisers and catalogers and art historians and dealers can do to help make our current art world into a more robust art history for the next generation. Today's program is a third program in the series, and if you have questions still afterwards, we will offer more programs in the fall, but later this month we have a keynote address about copyright as it pertains to estate planning for artists. So if you're interested in that particular type of questions, hold off and attend the program on the 14th. All right, so the first speaker to put us maybe into the position that fiduciaries have is Sing Lee Lathan. She is a creative director and producer of different projects. She is also with Black Lion TV, and her bio is in your handouts. And Sing is going to talk to us about a particular foundation. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you about your experience.
Thank you for having me.
Sing, we can't hear you.
Oh, did you want me to start talking?
Yes.
Okay. I thought you were
yes,
going to ask me a question.
Okay.
Okay.
No, I think if it's all right with you, if you can talk to us a little bit about Romare Bearden Foundation, and then.
So I joined the board of the Romare Bearden Foundation in 2017, and I was a member for 3 years till 2020. It was a board that I feel like it needed a lot of work, and I wanted to join to be effective and useful because I had a personal experience with Romare Bearden. He was one of my father's dearest friends and who my father worked with for almost a decade, I believe, towards the latter part of his life. My father also did a book. My father, Frank Stewart, is a photographer, and he documented Romare Bearden along those 10 years or 20 years. I can't remember if it was more than that, but the last 10 years, he was pivotal in his life. And these are some of the images from the book. That's the cover. My father is up in the middle on the top left, Romare Bearden, and then Johnny Simmons, who is a cinematographer. And that's myself and my sister in the middle with Romare Bearden. And this is one on the right is a collage that Romare Bearden signed to me when I was about 5. So, yeah, it was great to be on the board. I felt very prideful of it, and I was happy to serve.
So you have mentioned a few interesting facts. So for example, your father was a friend of the artist and photographed him. So there is a little bit of a archival connection. And how long did you know Bearden, approximately?
He died I was about 8 years old when he died.
And was his work particularly influential for you as a creative person?
Yes, 100%. Both my parents are artists. My mom is a fine artist, visual artist, and my father's a photographer. but going to Romare Bearden's house and studios and all of his spaces was always a treat, because one of my fondest memories, or most remarkable memories, was always walking into his studio and seeing little pieces of paper scattered across the floor. And it just looked like this, like sprinkles and like just all these colors and shapes and little trinkets. And when I was younger, my memory is because I was only a kid, so everything looks so much bigger. When I see my kids now, I'm just like, oh, this is when they do the little cutouts and stuff on the floor, I'm reminded of that moment of just the creative process and the pure joy in touching materials and art and crafts and creating out of paper. So yeah, it's a very special, it was very special to be on the board.
So he passed away in 1988, and I think the foundation was created a couple of years later. Where is it physically located? Does it have, what is its mission?
Well, the basic overview of his mission is to preserve the art and the mission and the foundation purpose of preserving Romare Bearden's legacy and art, and disseminating collage and artistic innovation across platforms. So to that, the foundation went through a few different changes, and they no longer physically have an office. And I'm not sure where it is currently today. With after the pandemic, what happened, I didn't follow, I haven't followed, but yeah, so.
Do you know if they asked, for example, your father to be on the board?
They have not asked him to be on the board.
Okay.
Can I ask a sort of overview question to pull back about Bearden himself? So you talked about his impact on you personally. Can you share a little bit about Bearden's impact on the art world, on the African American community? Yeah, just like sort of why he mattered, you know, more broadly.
Yes. Romare Bearden was such an iconic figure in those early 70s and 80s. And if you go through my father's Romare Bearden book, you'll see images of Romare Bearden with different artists of different genres, whether they be jazz musicians or writers like Albert Murray, who was one of his best friends, or James Baldwin, or Alvin Ailey. His wife, Nanette Bearden, was a really amazing dancer. I actually went to Harlem School of the Arts, where Sekou and I both went to Harlem School of the Arts, and Nanette used to be sitting in the lunchroom, and I used to walk up to her and say, hey, how you doing? But she was very influential in the dance world in our Harlem School of the Arts school. And yeah, I think he transcended just the physical fine art space, because he created conversations and poked at like certain critical elements of the Black culture that are still critical today.
And still studied today, right?
And still studied today. I mean, just take Sekou's mother, who is one of my biggest like heroes, who is featured on the top left
photo. Yeah. That's my mom.
Yep. So yeah, I'm one of her biggest fans, like all day. And I think he was very influential into her career as well. I believe Sekou, did she do her doctorate on Romare Bearden, or her thesis?
And she just published her own book about 2 or 3 years ago on Bearden as well. Yeah,
she's incredible.
So the foundation and the collection, I don't know if the collection is part of the foundation's mission. Are they located in different states, or are they all in one repository?
I've never actually seen the warehouse where they house it. It's like a storage facility, archival storage facility, but I believe there's 2 separate ones for the state and for the foundation. I've seen one of the foundation's or the estate shows at the DC Moore Gallery a couple years ago. But I don't know all of what was in the catalog. I didn't get that far, but I do know that they do have archive works, and they have all of his tools, all of his manuscripts, magazines that he was still using artifacts from inspirational moments. So that's part of the foundation's collection as well.
And does the foundation sell any of the works, or do they have a relationship with the gallery that
Yes.
represents?
Yes, they were represented at the time that I was on the board by the DC Moore Gallery.
So how would you, having served as a fiduciary on the board, would you talk a little bit about your experience and what kind of skills different board members would bring in, or what skills you felt were more necessary for the mission, or harder to find or easier to find?
I think, well, one thing I did notice, there were a lot of family members on the board. And I think what should always happen is getting a more diverse group of individuals to balance out perspectives. I think I was also brought in because I was one of more of the younger generations who still appreciated Romare Bearden's work, and created a space of the up and coming artist in the space that still appreciates collage and history and legacy. I think we should also have someone from the financial sector, someone from the legal sector. Those would be specific for the Romare Bearden Foundation, just to keep the legal aspects clear, the financial aspects clear, and help to move the mission forward and the foundation to raise money. There should be a development team that helps bring in more scholarships for other students. And also maybe an educator to help create more community and youth engagement. What I did really appreciate was when the Romare Bearden had a retrospective, I believe it was the Whitney, Sekou, am I wrong? It was, and maybe, oh, I forgot the numbers now, but they had a children's museum exhibit in conjunction with the retrospective. And they used some of my father's images, but they had a whole exhibit for kids, geared around kids, that was just very smart. And at the time, my son was maybe 5 or 6. And he just loved it. He went through the whole exhibit, and it was very hands-on and tactile and user-friendly. And I thought that was brilliant to connect and to cross platforms during a big Romare Bearden museum exhibit.
Do you remember, do you know if the foundation was set up before Bearden passed or after?
I believe it was after. So he had an estate set up as well as a foundation.
All right. All right. So if we will go back to this example, and if there are questions in the audience, please send them in. I know that there are questions about taxes, for example, how easy or difficult it is to donate to a foundation. I don't know if Sing if that's something that you want to mention.
I think anybody can donate to a foundation. I think that they should be conscious of where the money, or allocating the money specifically to certain, earmarking it to a specific type of purpose on the board would be probably a good idea, maybe, depending on how confident they feel that the board is set up. But yeah, I mean, I would welcome anyone to donate to the Romare Bearden Foundation or another foundation that speaks to them as an artist. We need the support.
And how much work was the foundation, or when you were working with the foundation, able to do for living artists? Was that part of their explicit purpose, or?
During my time on there, they had a few symposiums and lectures, but and I think they had, Romare Bearden was getting honored in Virginia, or there there was a sculpture being honored in his name. But other than that, at the time I was on the board, I couldn't say that there was much more than that at that time. I think they were going through a somewhat of a transition, bringing in insurgence of new members.
Got it. Thank you. So if we have questions, please send them in, and I will turn the floor now to Sekou Campbell. Why? Because Sekou is our expert on governance of nonprofit organizations, and Sekou is a partner at Culhane Meadows. He has done a lot of work with volunteer lawyers for the arts in Philadelphia, and he has written and practiced in the realm of copyright law. He is, I don't think he's a visual artist, but I think he is a performing artist from pre-law days. And the question that we discussed with Sekou before this program was designed was, so you have this car, you have a vehicle set up by the artist before they pass or after they pass, and how do you keep this car running? What do you need to check for under the hood to make sure that it gets good mileage and it accomplishes what the artist wished for it to do? Sekou, I'm going to give you control over the slides, and I think you have it now.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to say thank you to Irina and Sing. Sing, I've known longer than Irina, but Irina, I think it's almost 15 years I've known you, which is crazy to me. Irina was talking about this when we were in law school. And, you know, it seemed amazing, but impossible, but here we are. And so you've done such an amazing job with Center for Art Law. I just wanted to give you a shout out for that.
Thank you.
And Sing, of course, we grew up together. So in addition to everything else Sing said, she and I, my mother was at the Studio Museum in Harlem when her father was there. So we really literally grew up together, and they were both, you know, intimately involved with Bearden and with the Black art world generally. So, you know, we kind of grew up together. I never, again, thought that as kids we would be on a panel together. So this is really exciting and fun for me. So I thank you both for the opportunity.
I was honored. I'm honored. This is such an honor.
Thank you both.
Okay, here we go. So this is just a quote from the Aspen Institute. At the end of this PowerPoint, there's a list of resources, and the Aspen Institute is one of them. For anyone who's interested, they have resources aimed at lawyers and accountants, all the way to family members and artists. So it's a really tremendous, and it's all free. So it's a tremendous set of documents and reports that they make available to everyone. So I would definitely encourage anyone who's interested in learning more about this topic to sort of start there. The next thing, I'm not going to read all this. You don't have to read all this. If you have it in your materials, it's just a disclaimer. The bottom line is, like, I'm not giving you legal advice, right? So don't take this presentation and go start your own artist-endowed foundation. It won't work. You need to have a lawyer, qualified lawyer in your jurisdiction. Most importantly, as I'll talk about later, you need to sort of figure out which attorney or which attorneys you need, because this is such a complex area with so many different areas of practice. Sometimes one lawyer isn't enough. There are tax issues, there are estate planning issues, there are governance issues, there are intellectual property issues. So you have a whole host of issues that sometimes even first of all, you need a lawyer, but second of all, you might need multiple lawyers. So don't take any of this as legal advice, and certainly seek out qualified counsel in your area. What I'll talk about today, and also sort of model for you in general, is to sort of think, when you think of any kind of legal issues, is we really start with definitions, right? We want to know, what do we mean when we say certain things, or when we talk about certain concepts. So we'll go through some definitions, talk and go a little bit further into what artist-endowed foundations really are, different types of them. We've heard mention of fiduciary duty a couple times here. So I'll go a little further into that and talk a little bit more about what that means for board members of a foundation. then I have a little saying, I call it think in threes, which is just for any board member, it's just important to remember, even if you're compliant with one set of laws, there's often, particularly in the nonprofit world, there's a layer of laws from federal, state to local and or foreign law. So, just consider that. And then Irina talked a little bit about, sorry, let me go back. Irina talked a little bit about when does the foundation get created? So as Irina said, I'm on the governance side, so I don't often do artist-endowed foundation formation. So that's often working with estate planning attorneys, or if I do it, I'll do it in conjunction with an estate planning attorney. But it is an important consideration. So, it matters in terms of the governance of the foundation, whether or not it was formed during the lifetime of the artist or as a testamentary or as a part of their estate. So a foundation is actually not an actual thing. It's a designation provided by the Internal Revenue Service. So foundation requires a prerequisite organizing entity. And I'll talk about what those are in a second. But most importantly, it is meant for a public good. The best description of this I've heard is that it's almost like the government is using a private entity or private individuals to do public good, right? So instead of the government doing that work, whatever it is, if it's the Romer Bearden Foundation or the Warhol Foundation, et cetera, it's a group of private individuals who are doing that work, and the government then allows them to do that without paying taxes, gives them tax exempt status. And so that's really what is the sort of defining, driving thing behind the creation of a foundation, including artist-endowed foundations. The distinction here between a foundation and a charity is the source of the funding. So foundations aren't excluded from getting public funding, but the majority of their funding comes from the artist's endowment, hence the term artist-endowed foundation. I suppose I can note here, one thing that is often lost or trips up some artist-endowed foundations is making sure that there's enough capital to support the endowment of the artwork itself. So simply endowing a foundation with artwork isn't enough, because as I would think this audience probably knows already that there's a lot of costs, carrying costs that come along with artwork, storage, insurance, etc. So if there's not, and management and administration. So if there's no funding, if there's no money, cash available to do that, you might wind up selling a lot of the artwork anyway. So, and sometimes the purpose of that is not to sell the artwork, right? And I just want to sort of highlight the fact that the public charity and the private foundation is a distinction about where the money comes from, but in both instances, there's supposed to be a public benefit. There's supposed to be a public good that comes out of the foundation. So what might also be helpful is making sure we understand what a foundation is not. So it is not, as I mentioned at the outset, it is not an entity. So there are corporations, there are LLCs, there are trusts. Those are all entities, all formed at the state level. This is the first instance where we talk about the think in threes, right? So in order to get federal recognition of a foundation, you have to first go to the state and create an entity. And the most common entities for artist-endowed foundations are either a trust, and here you'll see an outline of what a trust is. Generally, there's essentially three categories of parties to a trust: the settlor who funds the trust, the trustee that legally owns the trust, essentially administers the trust, and the beneficiary that enjoys the benefits of the trust, hence the term beneficiary. That is formed at the state level, and it can be recognized as a 501c3, as a private foundation. The other major way to do this is by forming a corporation, a nonprofit corporation. Some states allow you to form a state level nonprofit corporation. Other states simply require you to form a corporation of any type, and then you get the status from the IRS. So it depends on your state. Here, and I sort of cribbed this almost directly from the Aspen Institute here. They define 4 different types of artist-endowed foundations, right? There are grant-making foundations whose basically primary purpose is to simply give money to another charitable organization that then achieves its charitable purpose. There's direct charitable activity. I think the Joan Mitchell Foundation that Irina presented earlier is probably in this category as a direct charitable activity or comprehensive. But what they're doing is trying to sort of provide direct services, almost like a public charity, to individuals and groups in whatever area, whatever their mission is. And then a comprehensive one is sort of a combination of 1 and 2, where they sort of do all of it in one foundation. The last one, and so the first 3 are artist-endowed foundations that are typically fairly large, right? They have either a large collection or a lot of funding, et cetera, so that they have the capacity to put on this programming. The smaller collections, the smaller catalogs will likely choose 4, which is often a time-constrained foundation. So its purpose is to sort of figure out what to do with the artist's work, as it either distributes the work to various family members or close loved ones, or donates it to a museum or a cultural institution. But generally, those have limited lifetimes, usually up to like 20 to 25 years. And they're more for modest collections that don't really have a sustainable amount of capital or assets to continue on. Oops. So again, so I'm going to refer to what Sing was talking about in terms of the diversity on the board. It's important that a lot of artist-endowed foundations have a number of interested parties, is what they're called, right? Folks who have some level of interest, either they're family members, they may be, gallery owners, or former business partners. Those are often the folks who knew the artist the best, and so have the biggest interest in sort of extending their legacy. And so it is important to have those kinds of folks on your board, but there's a risk, because what arises is a conflict of interest, and most importantly, there's a prohibition against private benefit under the Internal Revenue Code. And so one has to be careful about whether a particular activity confers a private benefit versus a public benefit, right? So, in general, what we want to see is so where that can arise, where there's a gray area, is if we're saying we want to promote an artist's legacy, for example. Well, that does have a public benefit, right? Like especially if we're talking about someone like Romary Bearden, who has this major impact on the art world, on the world in general. That's a public benefit. just talking about his legacy, talking about his artwork, his aesthetic view, etc. That all confers a public benefit. But there's also a private benefit, right? If you own a Rosemarie Bearden, then its value goes up as people know more about it. So that's a sort of gray area, and one needs to be careful about how the foundation makes decisions so that it's not perceived as a decision made to benefit the individuals on the board or who work for the organization. So yes, so thank you, Irina. I think advanced me a little bit to point that out. So that's the third bullet here. Note, however, mere promotion of an individual artist's work does not suffice as a public benefit. This is, I will note, this is a bigger danger when the artist is alive than when they've passed away, right? Because the legacy is clearer in that instance. And this is just an example. This last bullet is an example of where that gray area kind of went awry. So next we want to talk about what a fiduciary is. This is a quote from a sort of famous quote from our law school's namesake. Thought I'd throw that in, Irina. And basically what it says is that the fiduciary has a higher duty, is really the highest duty in the law than anyone else, right? So it's not the normal. We all have a duty to each other, right? To be responsible, to be reasonable, etc. But a fiduciary has a particularly high duty to others. And examples of those are the folks who administer your retirement plans, your ERISA, 401k, those folks, your attorney, your accountants. These are all folks who are fiduciaries, who have a higher standard under the law than a normal person. The other people who have a fiduciary duty are board members of artist-endowed foundations. And again, because so many, as I noted before, because so many board members often are insiders or interested persons or disqualified persons, one has to be careful when a foundation makes a decision that impacts those people, the people who could benefit personally. So there are three primary duties, but again, this is an area, again, think in threes, where you're guided by state law. So federal law is kind of kicks in. There are federal consequences, but a lot of times it's determined by state law. So your state may have more duties than these, but these are sort of the core set of fiduciary duties that we refer to when we think of a fiduciary duty. So loyalty is the self-dealing, is the enjoying a benefit that detracts from the corporation or the trust, the foundation, and doesn't benefit the public. Remember, I think it's useful to think of this as almost like a quasi-governmental organization, right? So it's like stealing from the public trust to enrich yourself. That's sort of the guiding principle behind the duty of loyalty. Next is the duty of care. Again, everyone owes each other a duty of care, right? We can't, drive our car recklessly or smack somebody upside the head. But this is even higher than the sort of normal, reasonable standard. So it's a much higher standard of care. So what it does is it eliminates the defense of, oh, I didn't know that so-and-so was stealing money, right? I didn't know that this was happening. Ignorance is insufficient to fulfill your duty of care in this circumstance. And the final one is a duty of obedience, which really has to do with the mission, right? So to be clear on what the mission of the organization is and make sure that your decisions always kind of track back to that mission, to that purpose. So, I often encourage foundations and public charities to think long and hard about their mission and really constantly revisit it when they're making important decisions. in part because of this duty, but also because I think in general, it's a good governance principle to live by, because it's something that you can always point back to and say, well, we thought this fit the mission because, and you fill in the because.
Sekou, very quickly,
Mhm.
the case that I mentioned related to Mark Rothko estate, there were 3 fiduciaries. One of them was an artist, the other was a friend, a professor, I think, in the anthropology department, and the third was a dealer slash accountant slash attorney. They were effectively accused of violating their duties as fiduciaries because they entered contracts very quickly with the gallery to sell works of that artist, and there was some, not necessarily kickbacks, but benefits that inured personally to at least 2 of the 3 fiduciaries. And the court said all 3 were on the hook for paying back $6 million in the case of all of them, and $9 million in the case of the 2 who were egregiously violating fiduciary duties. So this is a serious risk that fiduciaries take on when they accept positions on the board. And this conflict of interest policy slide, I think we have a few questions in the chat, so I wonder if we can skip the taxes, but fiduciary
Sure. I mean, just to respond to that, the solution often is to bring in at least one outsider, right? I mean, if you have 3 insiders, which you described were 3 insiders, right? All of different types, but they were all insiders. It's almost, and this is really important when we talk about decision making, is that even if those, I mean, it could be that those sales were perfectly fine, they were fair, right? The problem is that the process by which they decided to make the sale was so conflicted that it's hard to make the argument that this was okay, right? And that's probably why I'm not familiar with the case, so I shouldn't speak on exactly what the reason was that was provided, but if I were advising them prior to the case, I would say you have to have some type of outside disinterested person to help you make this decision, to establish a process to help you make these decisions. Because that process more above the decision itself will help you, will protect you, essentially, right? So even if most people disagree with the sort of the appropriateness of the sale, if you had an appropriate process in place, then you can say, well, we leaned on this process, so that we're covered. We don't owe the $6 million.
So the conflict of interest policy, can you say a few words about it, and then we'll open the floor for questions, if that's okay.
Sure. Well, I think I just did. Okay. What else can I say? What I would say is, so make sure you have disinterested members helping you make decisions. Make sure that you have a process in place for identifying when a conflict of interest arises. Because as you noted, the responsibility is shared. So just because you're not aware, think back to the duty of care issue, right? Just because you're not aware that a conflict of interest exists doesn't absolve you of having a responsibility if you enter into a transaction that is actually conflicted. And so you should have a policy in place and follow that policy of A, identifying if there is a conflict, and B, what to do when one arises.
Thank you. So we will be sending you our audience slides, so you will have access to the entire packet. But what I would like to do next is answer some of the questions that we received. So, for example, the latest being, can a foundation own pieces in multiple countries? I don't know if saying that might have been an issue, but Sekou, any objections to owning property in different countries?
It's not something I've dealt with, but I just issue spotting, I can't think of a reason why it would be per se prohibited. There may be additional things to think about for sure, but I don't think it's a per se prohibition.
Is that because you're planning on selling it in a different jurisdiction, or like what would be the real issue in having properties of artwork in different countries? Because of the sale of them, maybe in the tax purposes, or
well, if the artist lived in one place and and died in another place, so there might be some of the property in France and the other half in England. I think we had an example like that in the newsletter just yesterday, with different treatment affecting legacy of the artist.
Yeah,
so
I mean, I could think there's probably like export-import laws that are implicated. I don't know that tax would be implicated other than, you know, fulfilling your nonprofit purpose, because it's not a taxable organization. Yeah, so those are but to me, I think the biggest thing that I can think of off the top of my head are export-import issues, both in terms of this, whatever country the artwork is in the US or wherever the home domestic entity is.
Here's another one. Is there critical mass in terms of number of pieces that a foundation would have to make it worth establishing a foundation? What kind of, I think it would be a little bit of a review, but what kind of calculations should go into foundation creation? Is there a rule of thumb? You know, how much money do you need for a particular purpose?
I don't think it's the quantity, but maybe the quality, the amount of the value of the works that would probably, I mean, maybe you have a Basquiat that you wanted to put into the foundation, and that just is the full endowment of the organization that you're creating. So I don't think it's the quantity of the art, but more of the value or the market value that's put on it, or what, what's the actual real value. And then I would also piggyback on the fiduciary. I was going to piggyback on Sekou's fiduciary moment. I think it's important to have a clear business plan with a projection of 5 to 10 or 3 to 5 to 10 years out, so that it's very clear on the board what is happening, what the plans are, and then you find the board members that will help you carry out and realize that mission and that plan for the foundation, so that there is no gray areas, and it's just action oriented at that point.
That's a great advice. I remember one of our professors, I think he was in his 90s, and his favorite joke was, how many times should one be married? A woman should be married. He said 4 times. One should be a lawyer, one should be an actor, one should be a priest, and another undertaker. It's like the 4.
Oh, the undertaker.
So if we were to form a perfect board for a foundation, if the financing are not the main issue, the skills should be legal skills, accounting skills perhaps, but certainly somebody who knows how to handle the materials. And
yes. And I also want to add that the people on the board shouldn't actually be doing the work. So the lawyer shouldn't be drafting the legal documents. The financial banker that you have on the board should not be doing the accounting for the foundation. They should just be overseeing and making sure and ensuring that the board hires the right organizations, the right lawyer, the right firm to represent the foundation. Having a curator on the board to ensure that we, as the board and the foundation, hire the right or have the right representation from a gallery that will best serve the foundation and the legacy. So I think knowing the roles clearly from the Board of Trustees is a good place to start as well. What do you think, Sekou? Do you think that's?
No, I agree. I definitely agree with that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty particular to the organization in terms of what you need for your board, particular to the mission. Yes, you're right. You know, there's those sort of foundational people, you know, someone who knows the law, someone who knows accounting, someone who knows finance. those are probably ones that are probably always necessary or useful on a board. After that, I think it's important, for a lot of these foundations, I still think it's important to have those family members, close business partners on the board. We talked a lot about what the dangers are of that, but they're still very, very useful to have on the board. They are sort of the living embodiment often of the artist, in many circumstances. And then, experts, people who know that artist or the field or whatever the purpose of the foundation is.
Yes.
What about the duration of a board member appointment? Should there be a cap? Should there be a minimum?
Yes, yes, and yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, for artist-endowed foundation, I mean, it's sort of my standard for most nonprofits is, I say, if you're doing it if you're on the board for more than 10 years, it's probably time to cycle off. So that usually looks like a staggered board of 3 years each. So you never have more than a third of the board cycling off at any one time. And you have a term limit of three terms, right? So that's generally that's sort of my standard piece of advice. I do, again, think, when you have foundations that are closely linked with a family, that becomes a little tougher. You might need to have a longer term than just 10 years to accommodate for family members who might want to stay on the board, for most of their life, for more than 10 or 15 or 20 years. So other than that, I think, it is really important to have fresh new board members cycling onto the board of a foundation. And then also talk to your estate planner, because the foundation, because it should be a public benefit, while I think it's important to have family representation, it's not solely about the family, right? It is meant to have a public benefit. So, the estate planning attorney can create a separate entity for that purpose, right? That's not the foundation, for the purpose of honoring the family and maintaining, some of the more personal sort of assets of the family. But the foundation is for a public benefit. So, like I said, I like having some family members on the board. They can have a slightly longer term, but generally speaking, 10 years is the rule of thumb.
So for those of you who have attended our programs, you know that I really like looking at, not only looking at headlines. And yesterday, there was an announcement that part of the Nancy Holtz archives are going to the Smithsonian. I took a look at her legacy plans. So she passed away in 2014, and she was administering a estate of her, I think her husband, correct me if I'm wrong, Robert Smithson. So there's a Holt-Smithson Foundation. And what is quite interesting is that this foundation is planning to terminate in 2038, after 100 years after Nancy was born, with the idea that in the period between then and now, they will be administering and distributing property and following the foundation's mission, but then itself is terminal, right? It's one of those estate distribution foundations in the making. And then another example that I wanted to bring to you is the Christopher Burden estate. It is not a foundation. The artist, after he died, I think he had a will, and he willed his intellectual property and art to his spouse. So while the estate is still in the process of being fully closed, distributed, etc., 6 years after the artist died, there's a lot of legacy planning that is taking place. So the thought that I think is quite important is when we use, and thank you, Sekou, for saying the foundation doesn't mean much, it's a vehicle, right? We're not saying this is the format that a legacy plan needs to take. But there are different ways of artists thinking about their legacy, if they care to preserve the works that they've created, they have options, which range from Rolls Royce, I suppose, to a rental. I think these estate distribution options are temporary, right? They're supposed to accomplish something important, but they're not supposed to be around in perpetuity. Do we have any more questions about this intermediary step, right? It's after the artist died and the legacy is, is legacy always there? Or is it something that needs to be worked upon by beneficiaries or by the living?
Oh, I think it's absolutely beneficiary to have a board that continues the conversation and highlights the work of the artist, because we can easily forget. So I think if we are constantly as a board pushing the artwork out, pushing the mission, pushing the information, that helps the next generation of artists, because we've already done the work, or we've already experienced a certain type of medium or innovation that artist has created, and a conversation that can be built upon and reflected on by the next generation.
So, Sing, if somebody comes to you today and says, would you be on the board? Will you be asking different questions? Will you say yes immediately or no immediately, or what have you kind of internalized or learned from first experience?
I would definitely ask a lot of questions, and Sekou has definitely coached me on this. Don't just jump into a board just to be jumping in. It's also consideration of my time. How much time do you guys actually need of me? Can I be useful? Can I be effective on this board? How well do I know this artist? Or do my missions, do my experiences and life experiences align with this type of artist or this mission that the board is trying to progress? Is the board messy? Are there conflicts of interest on the board? Are there board members that are in conflict who want different things for the foundation, or have different visions for how that mission is realized, and what that projection, that 3 and 5 and 10-year projection looks like? Is there money in the board, in the foundation, to enact all of these ideas that were in the mission or the business plan? So I would definitely have a lot of questions.
To answer your question, Irina, too, I just wanted to add, and thinking specifically of Rosemary Bearden, like, there are plenty of artists who just didn't have the opportunity to be seen. Yeah. So in terms of understanding their importance and their or didn't get the credit for the influences that they had on the art world.
Yes.
And of course, that's certainly true of African-American artists, right? I think that's sort of widely acknowledged. So in that context, for sure, I think preserving and giving just due to artists' legacy is really important. So some, and women as well. I mean, there are some sort of right now, really, there are some very old Black artists, primarily, and women specifically, who are getting huge shows at like 85, 90 years old, right, simply because they just never had the opportunity before the last 5, 10 years. And so I absolutely think a legacy is something to be nurtured, cultivated, acknowledged, particularly in light of the fact that I'm actually working on an article right now about the legacy of the cakewalk, which, for those who aren't aware, cakewalk was a sort of ceremony that was done by slaves in the winter of this little sort of thing that they did in front of their masters was a cake. So they called it a cakewalk. And it serves as the sort of use the euphemism for cakewalk now. Well, that ceremony was copied in minstrelsy. That's where blackface was born. And then Black people put on blackface. So we have multiple appropriations going on. And that's been repeated over time up until like in the news right now, there's all this talk about Black TikTok creators, right? So there's a history in our country of appropriating Black artists and providing that, giving that legacy to white artists. So I think it's particularly important for Black and female artists to preserve their legacy and cultivate it in their foundations. So I just wanted to make sure I answered that question for that specific issue, because I think it's really important.
Thank you. This is actually one of the reasons we are really keen on this subject. The center introduced an immigration law clinic last year, and we have other ambitions for other clinics, but there are lots and lots of artists who are very important, very talented. They are not represented by galleries. They're not well known. They haven't been exhibited. And I think it's not only a shame, but I think allowing galleries to make all the decisions, if the artist is not picked up, then they're not part of the canon or they're not important. I think we who are, speaking for myself, who are not brave enough to be artists, we can be brave enough to protect creative people for the future study purposes. And it would be fantastic as we're wrapping up, we will send you guys a survey. We're looking for subjects to discuss. We're looking for feedback. It would be fantastic if we could help create some kind of a repository, or 50 repositories, one in each state, where works of artists who are very deserving but not able to set up their own foundations would be able to send part of their archives or part of their top 10 works for minimal legacy creation, but definitely assurance that they're not lost to the art historical process. In the fall, I think one of the webinars we'll do is we will have a gallery representative, galleries that are focusing on estates, to see how we can help new galleries take on these daunting tasks, because there are cost benefit analysis to everything. But I think the more lawyers are willing to be trained and more galleries are willing to take on new tasks, and new fiduciaries are able to rise up to the occasion, I think we can recognize that the canon is much bigger than what is presented to us in the headlines. Any more questions? I wanted to acknowledge that we've received some really great comments from Ella Dodson and Betsy Anderson. We will take your questions and suggestions to heart. In the fall, we also have a new fellow who is going to step in and review all of the materials we've been creating to make sure that the clinic is growing and offering robust services. Last thing I'm going to say about the estate planning clinic is that on the 14th, we have a number of attorney volunteers and appraiser volunteers standing by to talk to individual artists about their issues from different states, from Florida, from Connecticut, New York, of course, and others. So if you have specific questions, I would like to try and get some answers. We will try and get you some answers then. Any last comments before we close our program for today?
Can I just do a quick plug?
Yes, please.
So I sit on the board of a festival called Black Star Film Festival. It's coming up August 4th, starting August 4th through August 8th. So I'll put the link in the chat. Please come out. We are one of only 22 film festivals in the world that are qualifying for, that is a qualifying festival for the Academy Awards in the documentary section, because theaters are closed right now, or were closed. So please come join us. I just put the link in the chat, but I don't think it's a link. So it's blackstarfest.org. I don't know why it didn't come up.
Is it online or is it a hybrid?
It's all virtual. Yeah, I mean, if you're in Philadelphia, there are some live events, but all the films are virtual and all the panels are virtual.
Brilliant. Thank you. Virtual is easy. So
Yeah,
I think we'll send out more reminders. If our attendees, if you have questions for the speakers, we can put you in contact. And again, thank you all for joining us today, giving us ideas. Take a look at the handouts. There's a lot of good material there, and do take the survey. It's a very important tool for us to gauge where we're supposed to be going to next. Sing, thank you so much. I'm hoping somebody will invite me to be on the board, and I will take your counsel to heart, and I will think very hard and long to know
The
if I
next
have the
board I'm
capacity.
on, I'm bringing you with me.
Yes.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a pleasure and an honor, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing in the art law space. We as artists really, really need you and Sekou to guide us, because we're just the creatives, and we need to be able to focus and to see the bigger picture and to understand what we're able to do, what we're not able to do, what's appropriate, what's protecting our art and our person and our intellectual property. So I think you guys are essential to how artists can survive. So
we're just lawyers. We don't really do much.
You're more than that.
It takes two. It takes both types. So thank you. Sekou, thank you so much. Until our next project.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for thinking of me, and I look forward to it.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye. Goodbye, everybody. See you next week, perhaps.